This is, or rather was, the Empire Cinema in Lambton Street in the centre of Sunderland. It's one of Sunderland's more recently built cinemas, having first opened its doors in 2004. It also holds the sad distinction, at the time of recording, of being the final remaining cinema in Sunderland city centre before it abruptly closed down in July of 2023. As things stand currently, the nearest cinemas Sunderland folk can go to are in two different directions down the A19, the closest being in Bolton, very much on the borderline of Sunderland and neighbouring South Tyneside. The increasing popularity of streaming and huge television sets, the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, a seemingly ever-spiralling cost of living crisis, doubtless these have all played a part in Sunderland's cinema's decline. There was a time, of course, when things were very different. Going to the pictures at least once a week used to be the main form of entertainment for Wearsiders. And hard as it is to believe now, there was a time when Sunderland's town centre had a cinema on practically every corner. In addition, many suburbs of the town could also boast their own local picture hall. You could go and see a film on your local high street as easily as, for example, you could track down a branch of Greggs on them now. This building in Wearside was first opened in 1932 as Black's Regal Cinema, and it cost a whopping £100,000. It could seat 2,500 people. Bear in mind that an average modern multiplex auditorium holds around 230. It also employed more than 60 staff. Today, as you can see, it's a branch of Mecca Bingo. But happily, we aren't here to lament the brutal gutting of the original elegant building. Quite the contrary. Inside, it still has what the Cinema Theatre Association describes as the finest surviving cinema auditorium in the northeast. Perhaps surprisingly, given this pedigree, the building isn't listed, but it is extremely well maintained by Mecca, who own the premises outright. Richard Gray of the aforementioned Cinema Theatre Association has said Sunderland Regal, as was, possesses the largest and best remaining 1930s cinema auditorium in the northeast, north of York in fact. The highlight of the auditorium is the original pair of dancing ladies on either side of what was the stage, where live entertainment went hand in hand with cinema. When Black's Regal first opened, the talkies had already begun. How can we explain this to young people? Early films essentially had no audio track, a situation that only changed in the 1920s. Many careers were abruptly ended when the real-life speaking voices of various hunks and vamps were not all the public might have hoped them to be. But in 1932, while the writing was on the wall for silent films, they were still being made. Therefore, an organ was required for musical accompaniment, and the Regals was a magnificent example. The venue was equipped with a fabulous Compton theatre organ, the best that money could buy, which rose from beneath the stage floor. The first organist was Arnold Eagle, or Eagle of the Regal, as he was inevitably referred to, until he left in 1946. Today the organ is stored in Ryop, having been bought by the Sunderland Theatre Organ Preservation Society. Yes, there is such a thing, when the cinema closed. In 1959, Black's was taken over by the Giant Rank organisation and became the Odeon. The front stall's entrance in Park Lane shut permanently in 1964 and capacity fell by 300. It was divided into a 3-screen cinema in 1975 with 1,200 seats in the former circle and two 150-seat screens in the rear stalls. The early 1980s was a barren period for cinemas generally, with video hire shops becoming all the rage. On June the 26th, 1982, the Odeon closed permanently and its seats were stripped out. The venue soon reopened as the top-ranked bingo hall and eventually the Mecca. The last pair of films to be shown on Wearside were The Empire Strikes Back, the second in the umpteen movie Star Wars franchise, and Mary Millington's True Blue Confessions, which was a tawdry tribute to one of the 1970s sex symbols. Cinema, of course, was not done for in the 1980s. It was very much the age of the blockbusters. Just a little way up from the former Regal Cinema is another place where it was open until the last year of the 20th century, and quite often, for a big film, you would see queues proverbially, or literally in fact, going right round the block. Right here, in fact, is where our cameraman joined the afternoon queue to see Batman in 1989 and later Jurassic Park in 1993. At least one reader of the Sunderland Echo has assured us that queues for the original Star Wars in 1977 went round the building at least twice. Getting into these queues felt like settling in for the duration, and orders of chips and gravy from the baker's oven across the street were not an uncommon pre-cinema snack. And here is where the front of those queues would have been. now a collection of night spots called The Point. It was in its time variously the Ritz, the ABC, the Cannon, and then the ABC again. Echo reader Anne Work had some recollections of going to see Psycho here in 1960. She told us it was the first time you could only go in to see it from the start, as at that time cinemas had continuous rolling viewing. You could actually stay in all day if you wished. She remembers the looks of faces of people who came out of the first house. If you were second house, people were coming out after seeing it with horrified looks on their faces. Mickey Thompson shared an equally horrifying moment with us from towards the end of the cinema's lifespan, when he went to see Titanic there and lost 4 teeth eating a peanut brittle. Picture houses were so common back in the day that here in Monk Weymouth there were a couple of them just 300 feet apart. They were the Roker and the Cora. The Cora was the elder, having opened in 1907 as the Wheatsheaf Picture Hall. Of course, Sunderland still has a Wheatsheaf pub very near where the Cora stood. When Mackems referred to the general area of this junction, they still called it the Wheatsheaf. In 1911, the picture house changed its name to the Coronation Picture Palace, known by everyone as the Cora, to mark the coronation of George V, and the building was more or less where I'm standing right now. And it didn't exactly have right royal standards. Indeed, it was perhaps one of the first Sunderland cinemas to be known fondly among locals as the Flea Pit, no doubt thanks in large part to its temporary closure in 1930 by the Health Authority. It was unusual in that the cheapest seats in the very front stalls were simply benches. The toilets, as was common at the time, were outside, with access via the front stalls. But on the plus side, the prices were as low as the standards, with prices at 2 or 3p, compared to the 2 shillings over the river at the Regal. Not far off was the Roker Cinema, aptly enough on Roker Avenue. In that cinema's early years, each film was accompanied by music from a 10-piece orchestra. The cinema was right behind where I'm standing now. During the 1920s, Friday nights at the Roker were trial nights, when local amateurs could perform on stage between the showing of the films, a spot of Roker's Got Talent, if you will. Both the Roker and the Cora were modernised in order to show talkies in 1931. The Cora eventually closed in 1959 and the Roker in 1961, casualties of the increasing popularity of television. Another cinema in the vicinity that did not make it that far was the Bromarsh. It stood over the road from where I am now. I'm standing at St Peter's metro station. Opened in 1906, the building had previously been a chapel before it was a waxworks exhibition. It was renamed over its lifetime from Monk Weymouth Picture Hall to the Bridge Cinema and then the Bromarsh. It would have stood round about here, but it was destroyed by bombs during World War II and it was never rebuilt. There was a particular poignancy to this tragedy, as 5 of 9 siblings lost their lives in this direct hit from Hitler's bombs, partly due to their youthful imaginations. Aged between 2 and 16, these 5 children of Bertie and Elizabeth Humble could have shared an area shelter with their downstairs neighbours in Howick Street. However, they were scared to do so because of the ghost stories their neighbours would tell. When a siren went off on May the 24th, 1943, the family headed instead for the nearby shelter in the basement of the Bromarsh Cinema. Only the parents and 3 of their children came out of the bombing raid alive. The shelter that they could have used back home, meanwhile, survived undamaged. The Havelock opened in December 1915 on the site of the old Havelock House store, from which it took its name. The first sound film to come to Sunderland would have been The Singing Fool, starring Al Jolson in 1929, and from the Havelock Cinema, the queues were stretching right down High Street. It was the only cinema in town which provided hearing aids which were attached to the end seats. It also boasted a fine cafe on the first floor. A light was built on the very top of the cinema in the shape of a diver's helmet. At one time, beams shone out of the 4 face pieces until one of them was blocked up, following reasonable complaints that, so close to the river's entrance, it was misleading at times for shipping. The remaining 3 light apertures were later blocked up due to blackout regulations during the Second World War and didn't make a comeback. Later changing its name to the Gaumont, the Havelock was another cinema that did not survive the television revolution, and it closed in the early 1960s. The Blacks Theatre Royal in Bedford Street, right here, really wasn't the place to be on your own on a dark night. And that's especially the case if you're a woman and you're in the women's staff room. If you were, chances were you'd get to see a vision of someone disappearing into the wall. All this is according to one man who should know. Bill Mather spent 53 years in the industry and recounted to us the uncanny events in the women's staff room, which was downstairs in the foyer. Women would not stay downstairs on their own, and all of them had experienced disturbing sightings of someone dashing across the floor area, through the wall under the underfloor area where the seats were stored, he said. It later emerged that the same underfloor area was once part of a boarding house where there had been a death. Bill also recalled a Mrs. Gray as the first female manager in the country to manage a cinema under the then Gaumont British Circuit, which had some 275 plus cinemas around the country. She was manager of the Palace, Sunderland, near the Empire from 1920 until its closure. It appears she was happy to pitch in with the everyday tasks though, as she used to play the grand piano, which was in front of the stage on Saturday morning junior shows. Even before the multiplexes started to close, the age of the picture houses at their height was long since over, but happily a little fragment of the romance of those days is being preserved. The Grand Picture Palace in Ryhope was another of those that was there for the arrival of talkies. Born in Ryhope in 1909, Jack Taylor became a projectionist at the Grand, aged 21, after being paid off from his job as a blacksmith. He once told the Echo about a member of the audience, I quote, Geordie the Bugger, who was a terrible loud talker and was there shouting his mouth off, saying you couldn't possibly make a picture talk. When it did, he was speechless. People who manage to know nothing and everything at the same time are not unique to the social media age. At the time of this recording, the same theatre that silenced Geordie is being rebuilt brick by brick at Open Air Museum, Beamish. It too had become a bingo hall in the 1960s, and by the 90s was being used as a place to store cars and their parts. But following an extraordinarily long intermission, the Grand is set to resume life as a cinema in its new home as part of Beamish's 1950s town. It's nice to know part of the vanishing legacy will be preserved. And on that, we fade out, but not before thanking Phil Curtis of the Sunderland Antiquarians for the enormous help he's given us in putting this together.